Hello, your lecture today is going to be about water pollution. We're going to start talking about ways that freshwater can be polluted, and then next time we'll talk a little bit more about how the oceans are polluted and some global effects. Groundwater is contaminated by these major sources, things like pesticides, herbicides, fertilizers, different types of organic compounds, and heavy metals. So major sources of this water pollution can come from landfills, storage tanks for any sort of petroleum product, especially if they're underground, they're more likely to leak and get into the groundwater, any kind of leaky septic tanks or sewer pipes, yards and golf courses, any intensely cultivated agricultural land, all of those things are going to have fertilizers and things like that on them. And any of this groundwater contamination, once it happens, it's very expensive to clean it up. So there's an estimated 250,000 tanks leaking in the US just at gas stations. And cleaning this up could take up to $500,000 plus per tank. So lots of states will actually impose gasoline taxes to cover cleanups and things like this. So one example of this locally was a spill that happened in Jacksonville, right next to Jarrettsville, and this was only back in 2000, I believe, 8, so it wasn't that long ago, but we're still seeing impacts of this. There was huge lawsuits about it. Part of the problem is that people can't sell their homes because they don't have good drinking water anymore, because these petroleum products that spilled remained in the groundwater. So any kind of groundwater contamination, we're going to see some pretty significant impacts. And when we see this pollution, it usually coincides pretty directly with how much we use the water. So remember, agriculture is taking up most of our water use, and we see that when we look at different types of pollution, a lot of times the largest chunk will come from agriculture. Again, that kind of goes along with that. However, what's interesting is if you look at something like nitrogen, agriculture makes up about 38% of that input to the Chesapeake Bay, even though they're using 70 to 85% of the water. So that does tell us that a lot of those farmers are trying to put things into place so that they're not polluting the groundwater as much, since of course they really rely on it too. So you can see that even though we don't have as much stormwater being used, that has a huge impact. Sewage treatment has a huge impact. Even air pollution has a huge impact. When we talk about water pollution, there's two types that you need to be aware of: point source pollution and non-point source pollution. So point source pollution, we can point to where it comes from. It's a single source, something like a factory or a wastewater treatment plant, or it's been dumped somewhere on purpose. You can point to it, you can find where it came from. So storm drains also can be considered point source pollution, but they might have a lot of non-point source pollutants in them as well. You can really reduce this by regulating it. So the Clean Water Act in particular, we'll talk about next class, that has significantly reduced the amount of point source pollution. Non-point source pollution is a lot harder to deal with because it comes from so many sources and you can't really pinpoint one location that it came from. There's lots of people who are responsible for this. So any kind of use of fertilizer, remember it's not just farmers that use fertilizer, people use it on their lawns also. Pesticides, pet waste, or animal waste of any kind from livestock, etc. Different toxins that are coming through the ground, like heavy metals, air pollution that's interacting with the water cycle and causing acid rain and that sort of thing. That's all feeding into that non-point source pollution. Any kind of oil coming off the roads, anything like that would be considered non-point source. So anytime we talk about air pollution, we really have to try to account for that in water pollution and see if it has an effect. Also, this could include things like soils and sediments and the things that they carry with them when they get carried through our water supply. So all of these contaminants can seep down through our soils and into our groundwater, into our streams. And when that happens, we call that leaching. And these non-point source pollution sources really contribute a ton of pollution to our water supply. So they're really important to take into account. Now, we have something set by the EPA that is called the total maximum daily load. So this is basically the maximum amount of pollution that is allowed in our water. And this tells industries and other people basically how much they can pollute. So it is actually allowed to a certain extent. And you'll see in our map here, we can see some of the problem areas in Harford County. This green area is anything that we're getting too many nutrients in our total it's going above our total maximum daily load. And then the yellow area is where we're getting too much sediment into our water. The gray area, we don't have data that's been collected. So this total maximum daily load is basically set by the Maryland Department of the Environment, and it also has to be approved by the EPA. And it regulates how much of each of these chemicals, like nitrogen, phosphorus, different things like that, can get into the bay in one day. So that's kind of how we keep track of this pollution. Now, pollution falls into a bunch of different categories. So one type of pollution is thermal pollution. And basically, this is any time the temperature of the water changes. And even though you think, okay, we're just changing the temperature, that can't be that big a deal, this really has a big impact on the environment. So a lot of times the reason for this is industries will use water to cool off their machinery, and then they take that hot water and they feed it right back into the stream or whatever body of water it came from. Or they're using it as a cleaning agent, they're boiling it or creating steam, and then they're releasing that back into the environment either as a gas or back into the stream again. But thermal pollution can also come from development and deforestation and any kind of soil erosion. When you take away those riparian buffer zones, remember everything heats up because water has that cooling effect. But water needs areas like shade along the riverbanks. It's going to keep it cool. It is going to heat up if it's exposed to direct sunlight. And the less soil you have in a place, the less vegetation you're going to have, and the higher your water temperature is going to become. Now, why is this a bad thing? Well, for a couple reasons. First of all, the body temperature and heart rate of all organisms tends to increase with higher temperatures. And that means that all your organisms that are living in that body of water need more oxygen to do cellular respiration because they have to provide that extra energy for that higher body temperature and that faster heart rate. So they need more oxygen in the first place. The other trouble is that heat actually decreases the amount of dissolved oxygen that water can hold. And this is really destructive to developing eggs and young fish. And one of the things that we see is that water really holds less oxygen when it's warm. And part of the reason for that is that warm water allows so much more oxygen to escape out of the top of the surface of the water, where that cold water kind of packs it all in. So cold water is able to keep a lot more dissolved oxygen in the water than the warm water. And that means that in warmer water, there's going to be less oxygen available to those fish in the first place. And then that combined with their increased metabolic rate is going to mean that oxygen gets used up very quickly, and there's just not enough of them for it to survive. So you're going to get these dead zones. You're going to get these huge fish kills that happen as a result of that. So we want to look at some ways that we can get around that and avoid thermal pollution. And a bunch of those ways revolve around keeping the ecosystem healthy in the first place, planting those riparian buffers around the rivers so that you have that shade, and then restricting the ability of the industries to use river water to cool facilities, or making sure that they cool that water back down again before they return it back to the environment. Another type of pollution that we should be familiar with is herbicide and pesticide runoff. So pesticides kill pests like insects and things like that. Herbicides are weed killers. Either one of these can usually be toxic to a lot of other things besides pests and weeds, and these easily get dissolved in runoff, or in some cases they will actually evaporate along with the water, and then acid deposition or other sorts of deposition can occur when it rains, and that pesticide makes it back to the environment. So some impacts of this, obviously if they kill other organisms like pests, then they're going to kill some of our naturally occurring organisms also. And remember that whole idea of biomagnification, where it's going to wind up increasing in the amount of toxin that's in each level of our food chain. So by the time we get to the top, these guys are going to have this really concentrated amount of toxin in their bodies. And that, of course, we've seen the effects of that many times before. So some solutions to this is to try to use less herbicides and pesticides when possible. So a lot of times you can kind of gauge based on how your crops are doing, how much you would need to use. Also, implementing integrated pest management practices instead. And in some cases, using genetically modified crops can help as well. We'll talk about that later. Planting those riparian buffers to reduce the runoff in the first place, and then also absorb some of those toxins that can all help, making sure your wetlands are healthy. Another problem that comes off of a lot of farms, but also off of people's land when they have pets, is animal waste or fertilizer runoff. So either when people fertilize their lawns or when they don't dispose properly of that animal waste, the excess nutrients, especially nitrogen and phosphorus, wind up in the water supply. And then we've seen what that can happen before. That causes eutrophication. So remember, in eutrophication you have excess nutrients. Those cause algae blooms. The algae bloom blocks sunlight from the underwater plants, so they can't photosynthesize, they can't produce oxygen. Also, when the algae starts to die off and decay after it's used up all the nutrients, that decomposition process removes oxygen also. So, and also if your water's already warmer from things like climate change, that's going to even increase the amount of dead zones you have due to that lack of oxygen. And this is a big problem in the Chesapeake Bay. Every year, the area that is a dead zone caused by eutrophication gets bigger and bigger, and you start seeing more of these mahogany tides and algae blooms out in the bay. As you start to have these increased nutrients and increased eutrophication, a lot of those SAVs, those bay grasses, start to die off. A lot of the basis of the food chain has been removed or changed around entirely so that other organisms don't really have a food source anymore. So some solutions to that is to really make sure that you're using fertilizer wisely. And remember, this doesn't just go for agriculture, this also goes for people's houses. So a lot of people do not need to use fertilizers on their lawns, but they do so anyway. Using soil testing techniques to really see if it's needed can help avoid putting those excess fertilizers out there. Also, growing crops that don't need as much fertilizer in the first place, or using crop rotation processes, helps to avoid putting so many nutrients into the environment. And restoring those wetlands, forests, and riparian buffers helps to take some of those nutrients out of the water before it reaches our rivers and streams. Another problem with excess nutrients is sewage treatment and septic tanks. A lot of times these leak. So if they leak, you may have some untreated sewage, raw sewage, being discharged. Or in some cases, sewer lines are actually designed to overflow during major rainstorms, or if you have a flood, or even at times of high use. So the big joke is that during the Super Bowl, you get this surge of sewage, and that's actually absolutely true at halftime. A lot of times these sewer lines will overflow. And in some cases, they're built that way. They're built to overflow into the rivers. So obviously, you're getting all this raw sewage that's not going to be a good thing. For a couple reasons. Of course, it has the excess nutrients in it because they haven't been removed by sewage treatment. It also has things like coliform bacteria and other pathogens in it that can cause diseases, things like typhoid and cholera. So in addition to eutrophication, now you have a major human health issue on your hand. If you look at wastewater treatment throughout the world, you can see that in areas, especially those less developed countries, the sewage treatment is not very advanced, and there's quite a bit of leaking of this system. So some solutions to this are to try to encourage regular pumping of septic tanks and also maintain those sewer lines so we don't have leakage. To have a plan in place for that overflow for those severe weather events, and try to separate sewer and stormwater drainage so that you don't have an overflow that causes raw sewage to go out into your rivers. To use more advanced sewage treatments and try to remove more of those nutrients in the first place, trying to incorporate more tertiary treatment processes. And also, again, protecting those wetlands and those riparian buffer zones so that they absorb some of the nutrients will also help. Another major problem with pollution is erosion and sedimentation, basically getting too much sediment in the water. And that happens basically anytime you develop an area, so that could be mining, it could be clear cutting a forest, clearing land for development. It could also come from poor farming techniques that would expose soil to erosion, although those are becoming less and less common because farmers, again, want to keep our resources in good shape so that they can use them. Also, any kind of major storm is going to move sediments around as well. So this is actually Chincoteague Island, and you can see the changes that happened just because of Hurricane Sandy. So why is this a bad thing? Well, anytime you have more sediment in the water, that causes the turbidity to increase. So turbidity is basically a measure of cloudiness. So this is really high turbidity because there's a lot of sediment in it. This is really low turbidity. So a lot of times when we look at water and we see it's all kind of murky, we assume that it's really bad water quality. But a lot of time it is just sediment, and it doesn't necessarily mean it's terrible, although it does have some impacts. So one of those impacts is it clouds the water, and then there's less light reaching those SAV, and that's going to decrease photosynthesis. It's also going to decrease productivity for the whole ecosystem. It can smother the bottom-dwelling organisms and literally make it so that they can't get enough oxygen, or so that they can't photosynthesize. And it also prevents young oysters from settling, and oysters help to clean the water and take this sediment out, so that becomes another feedback cycle that makes the process even worse. So in order to measure turbidity, we usually use something called a Secchi disc, and you can see the spelling right there. And basically you have this disc with these black and white areas, and you lower it until you can't see the disc anymore. You can't tell the difference between the black and the white. And these Secchi discs can basically tell us, if we know that normally we can lower it to a certain level and still see it, and then in other areas or at certain times we can't see it at that level anymore, it tells us that there's more sediment in the water, or there might be more algae in the water instead. And either one of those things might indicate some water pollution problems. So some solutions to erosion and sedimentation: different farming techniques like contour farming and low-till or no-till farming can help keep all the soil in place so that it doesn't get washed away in runoff. Any way that you can avoid disturbing huge tracts of vegetation or areas where you have a lot of soil, like practicing better development practices, can help. And also keeping those riparian buffers intact, because they're going to hold all the soil on the banks of the stream so that it doesn't get into it. Alright, another area of water pollution is toxic waste dumping and runoff. So this is usually coming from industrial byproducts, but you also have all that household toxic waste. Remember, we looked at some of those in our last unit as well. And a lot of times this is either released directly, sometimes on purpose, or stored in metal drums, and then those corrode and they start to leak the toxic waste. So some impacts of this: it can poison animals and plants directly. A lot of times it's acting as endocrine disruptors or causing other kinds of health problems like cancer, causing damage to brain, liver, kidneys. Remember that these also often bioaccumulate in the body and then biomagnify up the food chain. So in Maryland, you can see these are some of our toxic waste sites, and these are regulated. They can't dump very much, but there's always the chance that some of this toxic waste can get out. So some solutions for how to manage that is just making sure that the legislation and enforcement is in place to make sure that it doesn't get released in the first place. And again, that includes household waste as well, making sure that people aren't just dumping anything in a landfill, and that they're handling these substances properly. And then the last type of water pollution we're going to talk about today in freshwater is the actual solid waste, the trash that gets into our water all the time. So this is probably the most obvious form of pollution. And this is a problem we're going to talk about next time, things like the Pacific Garbage Patch, where this happens worldwide. In Baltimore, we do have a big problem with trash coming down through the Jones Falls and through that inner harbor area where people are littering, or it's getting into the waterways through these storm events. And we have something in place called the water wheel. And it's a really neat piece of equipment. It's out in Inner Harbor. This is right next to this tent-like building. You have Pier 5, the concert pavilion over there, and also the Center for Marine Biotechnology has a similar structure. And this water wheel is at the bottom of the Jones Falls River, and basically this river feeds into these buoys here, and the buoys help to collect all the trash that's floating on top. And there's a solar panel on this water wheel which helps to power it when it is sunny, and it's also using the force of the current as well to drive it, and it collects the water up and they empty it out periodically. It actually puts it on this little barge here so that they can take that away and then dispose of it probably in a landfill, but at least we're getting it out of the water and out of the system so that it's not going to go out into the oceans. So that's where we're going to pick up next time with some of those ocean water pollution impacts, and come in next class prepared to talk about some of that and also the laws about water. Have a good night. I'll see you tomorrow.